Lecture 36. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Virtual University's course on Business and Technical Communication. In the previous lecture, we were looking at paragraphs and reviewing how we could improve our writing by improving our paragraphs. In this lecture, we will continue reviewing the language and look at sentences. We will look at how to improve sentences and what the commonly found problems in sentences are, which include the use of stacked modifiers and noun. We will also look at wordiness, which is caused by the incorrect use of passive voice or active voice. Wordiness is also caused by nominalization, unnecessary repetition, and the use of unnecessary words and phrases. We will then look at overloaded sentences and how you can correct those, and sentence fragments and what to do so that your writing does not have fragmented sentences. We will also look at problems with the use of comma splice, fused sentences and stringy sentences, and we'll look at agreement between subjects and verbs. We look at using two or more nouns and how to use a pronoun with that. We'll look at sentences beginning with there. We'll look at indefinite pronouns, collective nouns, and quantifiers, and how all of these, if used incorrectly, can cause problems. We'll also look at pronoun antecedent agreement and how to use that correctly so that our writing does not have commonly found problems. Let's have a look at stacked modifiers and nouns. What do we mean when we talk of modifiers and stacked modifiers and how they can cause problems in our sentences? You need to avoid using long strings of modifiers or nouns. When we talk of modifiers, we mean those words which are added to nouns to add meaning to them. These stacked modifiers, if you are stacking more than one modifier to a noun or to a word to add meaning to it, they can be hard to read and sometimes they lead to ambiguity. पढ़ने वाले को ये क्लियर नहीं रहता कि किस चीज़ के बारे में बात हो रही है, ambiguous हो जाती है बात. If you need to add words, then add just a few words to make the relationships between nouns clear to the readers. अगर आपने अपने अल्फाज के साथ मॉडिफायर्स इस्तेमाल किए हैं तो कोशिश करें कि और कोई अल्फाज भी साथ में आप इस्तेमाल कर लें, prepositions या conjunctions, ताकि आपकी जो रिलेशनशिप है नाउन्स की आपस में वो क्लियर हो जाए. कुछ एग्जांपल्स देखेंगे, उससे ये बात आपको मजीद वाज़ेह हो जाएगी. A weak version of a sentence that we're going to look at is: previous work has shown that a purified pro-oxidant vitamin E deficient fish oil diet protects mice against malaria parasites. अब इसमें ये क्लियर नहीं हो रहा कि क्या चीज़ है जो माइस को मलेरिया पैरासाइट से प्रोटेक्ट करती है. प्योरिफाइड प्रो-ऑक्सीडेंट है, विटामिन ई है, फिश ऑयल है, या इन सब का मिला के कुछ है. कुछ इन सारी चीज़ों की रिलेशनशिप आपस में क्लियर नहीं हो रही. The improved version would be something like: previous work has shown that feeding a pro-oxidant diet containing fish oil but devoid of vitamin E protects mice against malaria parasites. अब ये देखिए कि जैसे कि जो weak version है उसमें भी और improved version में भी बात हो रही है that purified fish oil diet protects mice against malaria parasites. और जो बाकी इंफॉर्मेशन है वो मॉडिफायर्स है. प्रो-ऑक्सीडेंट, विटामिन ई डेफिशिएंट मॉडिफायर्स हैं, लेकिन कुछ इनका रिलेशनशिप क्लियर नहीं बन रहा कि ये जो है इनका फिश ऑयल से क्या ताल्लुक है और इनका बाकी मीनिंग, सेंटेंस के मीनिंग से क्या ताल्लुक है. इम्प्रूव वर्जन में वही बात हमने की, लेकिन हमने बताया कि प्रो-ऑक्सीडेंट डाइट कंटेनिंग फिश ऑयल बट डिवॉइड ऑफ विटामिन ई. इन्हीं चीज़ों को हमने ज़रा सी वजाहत कर दी, क्लियर कर दिया. मॉडिफायर्स को एक लाइन में लगाने के बजाय, एक दूसरे के साथ स्टैक करने के बजाय हमने उनके बीच में कंजंक्शंस, प्रेपोजिशंस दिए ताकि उनका आपस में रिलेशनशिप और उनका मेन नाउन जो है फिश ऑयल, उसके साथ रिलेशनशिप क्लियर हो जाए. Another example of such stacked modifiers is: we have analyzed low energy interplanetary charged sun sourced particle flux time series. अब जैसा कि आप देख रहे हैं इस एग्जाम्पल में दोबारा से बहुत सारे मॉडिफायर्स हैं जो एक दूसरे के साथ स्टैक किए गए हैं, जो एक दूसरे के फौरन बाद आते हैं, उनका बीच में आपस में कोई रिलेशनशिप नहीं है. लो एनर्जी, इंटरप्लानिटरी चार्ज, सन सोर्स, पार्टिकल, फ्लक्स, टाइम सीरीज. कुछ समझ नहीं आ रही कि मॉडिफायर्स कौन से हैं और नाउन कौन सा है, कि ये किस चीज के बारे में बात की जा रही है, मेन ऑब्जेक्ट क्या है. इसी की इम्प्रूव्ड वर्जन देखते हैं. We have analyzed the time series of fluxes of low energy interplanetary charged particle whose ultimate origin is the sun. Now as you can see, this becomes much more clear. Instead of saying sun sourced, we are talking about the time series of fluxes of low energy interplanetary charged particles, and then we're talking about their origin. We're saying that their origin is the sun instead of saying sun sourced. So it becomes much more clear as to what is being talked about. Another similar example of stacked modifiers is the system uses a high peak power single frequency low divergent light beam produced by pulsed lasers. अब जैसे कि आप देखें इस एग्जाम्पल में भी क्लियर नहीं है कि किस चीज की बात हो रही है. The modification of beam is difficult to sort out. We are talking about a beam. We're saying this is basically saying the system uses a beam. And then all the other information is what type of beam, but it's not very clear. A clearer version would be the system uses pulsed lasers that operate under high peak power to produce a single frequency light beam with low divergence. Now introducing these prepositions like with, introducing words like that, saying to produce, etc. Add more meaning to the sentence, and they actually show the connections between the modifiers and the noun. ये तो बात हुई stacked modifiers की और nouns की. Now let's have a look at wordiness. What do we mean when we talk of wordiness? Basically, you should say what you have to say in as few words as possible without sacrificing clarity or omitting vital information. Whatever it is you have to say, try to use the minimum amount of words, but make sure that the meaning comes across properly. मैं ये नहीं कहूँगी आपको कि आप कम अल्फाज इस्तेमाल करने के लिए जो आपका सेंटेंस है उसका मीनिंग चेंज कर दें, या इतने कम अल्फाज इस्तेमाल इस तरह करें कि बात पूरी तरह से वाज़ेह ना हो सके. लेकिन एक एक्सपर्ट राइटर वही है जो मिनिमम वर्ड्स में maximum information convey कर सके without confusing the reader as well. Conciseness is desirable in all writing, but especially so in technical writing, because as we've talked about earlier, when you're writing for a technical purpose or for business, your readers will not have time to spend so much time on trying to figure out what you're saying. They want everything concisely, they want everything that is things that they can digest within a glance. They're not reading for leisure, so they will not want to waste a lot of time in trying to figure out what you're saying. Excessive use of the passive voice, excessive nominalization, unnecessary repetition, and unnecessary words and phrases are some common causes of wordy writing, and we're going to have a look at these in a minute. Now you need to decide when to use the passive voice and when to use the active voice. You will use the active voice whenever the passive voice is not appropriate. Active verbs make for concise prose. Sentences with passive verbs use more words. So when you're aiming for conciseness, try to go for the active voice, because if you're using the passive voice, you will need to use more words. Moreover, passive verbs de-emphasize or even eliminate mention of the performer of the action that is conveyed by the verb. Every verb is performing and is conveying an action, and every action is obviously performed by somebody. जो भी एक एक्शन आप दिखा रहे हैं अपने सेंटेंस में, वो कोई ना कोई तो परफॉर्म कर रहा है, लेकिन पैसिव वॉइस में जो परफॉर्मर होता है एक्शन का, उसका जिक्र नहीं आता, जबकि एक्टिव वॉइस में तो आप क्लियरली बताते हैं कि कौन क्या काम कर रहा है. Let's have a look at an example which will clarify this for you. a weak version of a sentence would be, in this project, 3 psychological experiments were performed by the authors so that the technical problems for the oralization of a sound field could be clarified. An improved version is, in this project, the authors performed 3 psychological experiments to clarify the technical problems for the oralization of a sound field. अब इसमें देखें कि जो सेकंड पार्ट था, जो इम्प्रूव्ड वर्जन है, उसमें आपने एक्टिव वॉइस इस्तेमाल की. यू आर सेइंग क्लियरली द ऑथर्स परफॉर्म्ड टू क्लैरिफाई. द वर्ब्स आर इन एक्टिव वॉइस, whereas in the earlier one the verbs were in the passive voice. You're saying the experiments were performed so that the oralization of a sound field could be clarified. तो इसमें आपके ऑटोमेटिकली अल्फाज ज़्यादा इस्तेमाल हो रहे हैं, आपके सेंटेंस लंबा हो रहा है और क्लैरिटी उसकी वजह से कम हो रही है. Where possible, use verb forms instead of noun forms. इसको हम जब हम एक verb को noun में तब्दील करके और उसको noun form उसकी बना देते हैं, उसको nominalization कहा जाता है. An excessive or unnecessary nominalization, turning verbs into nouns, can make your writing wordy because it requires a noun and a verb instead of just the verb. जब आप nominalization करेंगे, एक verb को noun बनाएंगे, तो फिर आपको अपने sentence में verb भी चाहिए है, noun भी चाहिए है, जबकि आप बगैर nominalization के खाली verb से गुजारा कर सकते थे. Let's have a look at some examples which will clarify this point further. A weak version with nominalization is, a winglet may cause the introduction of a discontinuity in the lift distribution curve. अब यहाँ the introduction of जो है वो हमने nominalization कर दी और 3 अल्फाज इस्तेमाल किए. An improved version would be, a winglet may introduce a discontinuity in the lift distribution curve. यही चीज़ हमने जब verb को directly बोला तो winglet may introduce, बस एक लफ्ज़ के साथ ही हमने जो हमने बात 3-4 अल्फाज में की थी, cause the introduction of, वो हमने एक लफ्ज़ में कह दी. इसी तरह regeneration of the raisin bed is achieved by a calcium chloride solution. Now note that the main action of the sentence is located in the nominal subject, whereas the improved version would be, the raisin bed is regenerated with a calcium chloride solution. Here the main action of the verb of the sentence is now in the verb, is regenerated, जबकि पहले में हमने regeneration जो था उसको हमने nominalize कर दिया था. regenerated को हमने noun बना के और regeneration के तौर पे इस्तेमाल किया था, तो ज़रा सा जो मीनिंग था वो इतना क्लियर नहीं था. और अब द रेजिन बेड इज रीजेनरेटेड क्लियर हो गया, वर्ब फॉर्म इस्तेमाल हो रहा है, तो इसलिए पढ़ने वाले के लिए आसानी है. ऑल्सो ट्राई टू अवॉइड अननेसेसरी रेपिटिशन. वन ऑफ द मोस्ट कॉमन टाइप्स ऑफ अननेसेसरी रेपिटिशन इन्वॉल्व्स मॉडिफायर्स दैट रिपीट इंफॉर्मेशन गिवन इन द वर्ड मॉडिफाई. कई बार यह होता है कि जो हम लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल कर रहे होते हैं उसमें इंफॉर्मेशन पूरी होती है जो हमारे रीडर को चाहिए, लेकिन हम उसके साथ मॉडिफायर लगा देते हैं जो कि अननेसेसरी होता है, उसकी ज़रूरत नहीं होती, क्योंकि वो वही इंफॉर्मेशन दे रहा होता है जो मेन लफ्ज़ के अंदर है जिसको हम मॉडिफाई कर रहे हैं. इन द ऑन योर स्क्रीन नाउ वी विल डिस्कस show you a few examples and discuss some examples of recognizing and eliminating repetition. Let's have a look at this first example where the writer says, currently aircraft must be kept a minimum of at least 3 miles apart in the horizontal plane. अब देखिए कि इसमें क्या चीज है जो रिपीट हो रही है. मिनिमम ऑफ एटलीस्ट 3 miles. जब आपने मिनिमम कह दिया तो आपको एटलीस्ट की जरूरत नहीं है, या आपने एटलीस्ट कह दिया तो आपको मिनिमम की जरूरत नहीं है. ये दोनों चीजें एक ही मीनिंग दे रही हैं. द इम्प्रूव्ड वर्जन वुड बी, currently aircraft must be kept a minimum of 3 miles apart in the 3 miles apart in the horizontal plane. So here by taking out of at least, we are making the sentence more concise and much more effective. Another weak example would be, in 1928 Alexander Fleming discovered for the first time that penicillin mold could kill Staphylococcus bacteria in petri dishes. Fleming named the lethal antibacterial chemical secreted by the deadly penicillin mold, dubbing it penicillin. Now, there is a lot of repetition and we are going to see how this can be improved. I would like you to look at the sentence first to see if you can figure out the areas which are being repeated. Now, let's quickly have a look at the improved version. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered that penicillin mold could kill Staphylococcus bacteria in petri dishes. He dubbed the lethal antibacterial chemical secreted by the mold penicillin. अब जाहिर है जब dubbed कर दिया, कहा हमने that he dubbed it, that means that he named it. So that the saying, as in the previous sentence, Fleming named the lethal antibacterial, and then we said dubbing it penicillin, is repetition. Similarly, in the first part of the sentence, in 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered that penicillin could do this. We don't need to say discovered for the first time, क्योंकि जब जो एक discovery होती है वो होती ही first time है. उसके बाद अगर कोई चीज कोई देखे तो उस चीज को दोबारा देखें तो वो for the first time नहीं होती और वो discovery नहीं होती. So by saying discovery, you are the verb discovered shows that it was something that was looked at for the first time. So you don't need to say for the first time. Similarly, another sentence would be ability to separate from water is an essential prerequisite for a hydraulic oil to be used in plant systems where contamination of the hydraulic system by water is likely to form sludge emulsions of oil and water. Now there is so much repetition of phrases and terms in the sentence that it's not clear what the writer wants to say. A better version would be simply saying plants with hydraulic systems routinely exposed to water should use hydraulic oils that are immiscible with water. Now the same, it has the same meaning, it's much more concise, it's much more easier, it's much easier for the reader to pick out the meaning. Unnecessary words and phrases also make your sentences much longer, much wordier, much more difficult to understand. You need to make sure that each word and phrase in your sentence contributes to meaning and clarity. If there are any words, if there are any phrases in your sentence that are redundant, look out for them. अगर आपको आप अपने sentences को देखिए, अगर आपको लगे कि आपके sentences में कोई इस तरह के अल्फाज हैं जिनको आप निकाल भी दें तो आपके सेंटेंस का मीनिंग जो है वो चेंज नहीं होगा, तो फिर उन अल्फाज को निकाल दें क्योंकि वो रिडंडेंट हैं. ट्राई टू अवॉइड द कॉमनली यूज्ड कंस्ट्रक्शंस ऑफ देयर इज और देयर आर एंड इट इज. देयर इज, देयर आर और इट इज इस्तेमाल करना अपने सेंटेंसेस में जो है उससे आपके सेंटेंसेस कंफ्यूजिंग होते हैं, उनकी क्लैरिटी कम होती है. तो इसलिए कोशिश कीजिए कि इनको ना इस्तेमाल किया जाए, जो भी बात कहनी है वो डायरेक्टली कहें. अभी जब हम एग्जांपल्स देखेंगे तो ये बात आपके लिए और वाज़ेह होगी. इंस्टेड ऑफ सेइंग it is expected that by the year 2000 the Library of Congress will have digitized 5 million books and images, it would be better to say by the year 2000 the Library of Congress expects to have digitized 5 million books and images. अब देखें, it is expected के बजाय आपने Library of Congress expects कह दिया. एक लफ्ज इस्तेमाल हुआ जहां आप 3 कर रहे थे और जो आपका सेंटेंस है वो ज्यादा कंसाइज हो गया. Similarly, another weak sentence would be there is an electronic Beowulf project at the British Library that is preserving the original manuscript of the 11th century Anglo-Saxon epic. इसी की improved version है an electronic Beowulf project at the British Library is preserving the original manuscript of the 11th century Anglo-Saxon epic. इस sentence में भी हमने there is भी हटा दिया और that is preserving के बजाय खाली is preserving लगा के sentence को हमने बेहतर कर दिया. Similarly, let's have a look at another example where a question is being asked. Are the detection systems and secondary containments periodically performance testable to verify operability in the event that they are called upon to function? अब इस क्वेश्चन से कुछ समझ नहीं आ रही कि जो ऑथर हैं वो क्या पूछ रहे हैं, what the main question is. Let's have a look at the improved version of this same question to see how the question becomes clearer. Can the detection systems and secondary containments be performance tested periodically? Simple सी बात है. Can these systems and secondary containments be performance tested periodically over different periods? जबकि यही बात पहले सेंटेंस में इतनी लंबे तरीके से कही गई थी क्योंकि जो आइडियाज थे वो रिपीट बहुत हो रहे थे. Also, avoid overloaded sentences. Avoid sentences that contain more information than the reader can easily follow. अगर एक सेंटेंस में बहुत ज़्यादा इन्फॉर्मेशन होगी तो वो पढ़ने वाले को उसको डाइजेस्ट करने का टाइम नहीं मिलेगा, उनको समझ नहीं आएगी कि आप क्या कह रहे हैं. तो इसलिए कोशिश करें कि आपका जो एक सेंटेंस हो उसमें उतनी ही इंफॉर्मेशन हो जो पढ़ने वाले एब्जॉर्ब कर सकें. Divide your sentences. If your sentences are long, then divide them into more manageable pieces that can be easily grasped. Don't try to cram all your information in one sentence. It's perfectly all right to break down long sentences into shorter ones and also to give variety to your sentences as well. We've talked about different types of sentences earlier, and we've talked about how 7 different ways of writing sentences can be used to make 46 different types of sentences if you combine the basic 7 types. So try to give variety. Don't try to just have very long sentences, or don't fall into the trap of having very, very short sentences, very simple sentences. Give your sentences some variety and make them manageable. Let's have a look at a weak sentence where there is too much information. The sentence is overloaded. Because researchers interested in speech synthesis and automatic recognition need to find rules that improve intelligibility of speech, they need to study the psychological determinants more closely than before they can solve what has become a complex set of questions. अब कुछ इसमें समझ नहीं आई कि लिखने वाले ने क्या कहा है, क्योंकि इतनी इन्फॉर्मेशन दी गई है कि रिसर्चर्स को क्या करना है, वो किस चीज़ में इंटरेस्टेड हैं, कि आपको शायद 2-3 बार आप पढ़ेंगे तो फिर आपको इसका मेन पॉइंट समझ आएगा. Let's have a look at the improved version. Researchers interested in speech synthesis and automatic recognition need to find rules that improve intelligibility of speech. यहाँ एक सेंटेंस खत्म हो गया, पता चल गया कि रिसर्चर्स जो हैं, जो इस चीज में इंटरेस्टेड हैं, उनको क्या करना चाहिए. And then the next sentence starts by saying, consequently, they need to study the psychological determinants more closely before they can solve what has become a complex set of questions. अब आप देखें कि इन दोनों सेंटेंसेस में, इन दोनों एग्जाम्पल्स में बहुत फर्क नहीं है. जो पहला था वो एक ही लंबा सेंटेंस था, जो दूसरा था वो सिर्फ उस एक सेंटेंस को 2 सेंटेंसेस में डिवाइड कर दिया गया और consequently का लफ्ज ऐड कर दिया गया to show the connection, to show that it is something that will happen after as a consequence of what happened before, and it just makes the relationships much clearer. It makes it easier for you to understand what the writer is saying. Another example would be, in response to the leak history of the pipe made of 304L stainless steel, a work request IJ117 was prepared by plant maintenance in August of 1989. Took place approximately 55 of the HLD 304L pipe, the entire segment running from the cells area to the point in the drainage system that turns south to exit the building, with pipe made of a different material, Iconel 600, in brackets see figure N. Now, a completely incomprehensible sentence, कुछ नहीं समझ आ रही कि ये क्या कहना चाह रहे हैं, क्या बात हो रही है. बस ये पता चल रहा है कि कुछ पाइप्स का जिक्र है, बहुत सारे उनके नंबर्स हैं, कुछ लेंथ्स की बात हो रही है, लेकिन मीनिंग जो है वो समझ नहीं आ रही. Now let's have a look at the improved version. Plant maintenance responded to the leak history of the stainless steel pipe. ब्रैकेट्स में उनने पाइप का नंबर दिया है 304L, with a work request in August 1989 to replace a 55-foot section with Iconel 600 pipe. Full stop. Next sentence starts with, this section made up of the entire pipe segment running from the cells area to a point where the drainage system turns south to exit the building. See figure N. Now this makes the meaning much clear. It's the whole long sentence is divided into two sentences. The references to the pipe numbers are given in brackets rather than as part of the whole sentence, and it becomes much more easy for the reader to comprehend what the writer is saying. Another common problem with sentences is the use of sentence fragments. A sentence fragment is missing a subject, a verb, or both, but it is punctuated as if there were a complete sentence. एक सेंटेंस फ्रैगमेंट वो है जिसमें या सब्जेक्ट मिसिंग है या वर्ब मिसिंग है या शायद कभी कभी दोनों मिसिंग हैं, लेकिन उसकी पंक्चुएशन इस तरह है जैसे कि वो कंप्लीट सेंटेंस हो. जैसे कि हम पिछले लेक्चर में भी बात कर चुके हैं, एक कंप्लीट सेंटेंस वो होता है जिसमें एक सब्जेक्ट हो, एक वर्ब हो, बेशक वो दो अल्फाज का सेंटेंस हो. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, बेन ईट्स या बेन स्लीप्स या बेन इज स्लीपिंग, उसमें सब्जेक्ट भी है, वर्ब भी है. अगर कोई सेंटेंस है जिसमें सब्जेक्ट नहीं है या वर्ब नहीं है तो वो सेंटेंस एक कंप्लीट सेंटेंस नहीं है, वो फ्रैगमेंट होगा. सो इफ देयर इज अ मिसिंग वर्ब or a missing noun or both, then the sentence is not complete, especially if it is punctuated as if it were a complete sentence. Then you need to look out for it. We're going to have a look at some examples where we will see such sentences which do not make sense, and we will also correct them. It is unacceptable to say by virtue of their prevalence alone, full stop. And then the next sentence being, it is clear that mood disorders do not necessarily breed genius. Now, the part by virtue of their prevalence alone, which is made to look like a sentence because it has a full stop, it contains neither a subject nor a verb. You don't know what is being talked about, and there is no action being performed either. So it's clear that it is not a sentence, even though it looks like a sentence because it starts with a capital letter and ends with a full stop. An improved version would be that you repair the sentence fragment by adding the missing element, either the subject or the verb or both, or you can merge the fragment with a clause that does contain a subject and a verb. या तो आप इसी सेंटेंस, इसी फ्रैगमेंट को इम्प्रूव करके एक कंप्लीट सेंटेंस बनाएं, इसमें सब्जेक्ट या वर्ब ऐड करें, या आप इसको किसी ऐसे सेंटेंस का हिस्सा बना दें जो कि कंप्लीट सेंटेंस हो. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, जैसे अगला सेंटेंस है. लेट्स हैव अ लुक एट द इम्प्रूव्ड वर्जन्स. बाय सेइंग by virtue of their prevalence alone, comma, it is clear that mood disorders do not necessarily breed genius. यहाँ हमने इस fragment को by virtue of their prevalence alone, इस fragment को हमने दूसरे sentence का हिस्सा बना दिया comma लगा के. तो फिर ये fragment नहीं रहा, ये जो अगला sentence था उसका dependent clause हो गया. इसी तरह अगर आपको फ्रैगमेंट्स मिले अपनी राइटिंग में, आपको लगे कि आप जिनको आप चीज़ों को जुमले समझ रहे हैं वो जुमले पूरे नहीं हैं क्योंकि उनमें सब्जेक्ट नहीं है या वर्ब नहीं है, लेकिन वो सिर्फ देखने में जुमले लग रहे हैं, तो उनको आप डिपेंडेंट क्लॉज बना सकते हैं, किसी और सेंटेंस के साथ लिंक कर सकते हैं, या फिर उनको आप देखें और उनमें सब्जेक्ट या वर्ब ऐड करके उनको एक कंप्लीट सेंटेंस बना लें. अनदर कॉमन प्रॉब्लम विद सेंटेंसेस इज द यूज ऑफ कॉमा स्प्लाइस. A comma splice is when two independent clauses are linked with just a comma. हमने पिछले लेक्चर्स में देखा कि independent clauses क्या होते हैं, और अगर आप दो independent clauses को सिर्फ एक comma के साथ join करें तो वो comma splice होता है. And this is a common error in writing and this needs to be remedied. You can correct a comma splice in 4 ways. First, the first way of correcting a comma splice is that you separate the independent clauses into 2 separate sentences and punctuate both sentences with a period or a full stop. Basically, this means that if you have 2 independent clauses and you've got a comma between them, then you need to look out. Either what you can do is you can use those two independent clauses as two separate sentences. उन दोनों के बीच में आप फुल स्टॉप या पीरियड लगाएं ताकि वो इंडिपेंडेंट सेंटेंसेस बने, वो दो इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉजेस एक दूसरे के साथ रन इन ना कर रहे हों. और you can replace the comma with a semicolon or with a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb such as however or furthermore. The conjunctive adverb however, furthermore किस्म के जो अल्फाज होते हैं, they are normally followed by a comma. So ये आप ये पहले तो हमने बात की कि आप ये कर सकते हैं, आपने दो इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉजेज हैं, कॉमा से सेपरेट किए हुए, आप वहाँ कॉमा हटा दें, फुल स्टॉप लगा दें. दूसरी आप ये चीज कर सकते हैं, आप कॉमा रहने दें और उसके साथ एक कंजंक्टिव एडवर्ब लगा दें जिस तरह के हाउएवर, और फिर उसके बाद फिर कॉमा लगा के अगला इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉज जो है वो आप शुरू करें. तीसरा तरीका ये हो सकता है दैट यू विल रिप्लेस द कॉमा विद अ कॉमा एंड अ कोऑर्डिनेटिंग कंजंक्शन. आप कॉमा हटाएंगे नहीं, उस कॉमा के साथ आप एक कोऑर्डिनेटिंग कंजंक्शन और लगा देंगे और फिर अगला क्लॉज शुरू करेंगे. फॉर एग्जांपल कॉमा लगा के आप एंड लगा देंगे और अगला इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉज शुरू कर देंगे. और अनदर वे ऑफ रेमेडीइंग इट कुड बी दैट यू विल मेक वन ऑफ द क्लॉजेज इनटू अ सबऑर्डिनेट क्लॉज और अ डिपेंडेंट क्लॉज. जैसे कि हमने पहले फ्रैगमेंट्स में भी देखा कि एक हमने जो था क्लॉज उसको हमने डिपेंडेंट क्लॉज कर दिया. इसी तरह आप दो इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉजेस को साथ नहीं रख सकते कॉमे के साथ, आप एक क्लॉज को इंडिपेंडेंट करें और एक को डिपेंडेंट क्लॉज कर दें, फिर आप कॉमा लगा के उनको ज्वाइन कर सकते हैं. लेट्स हैव अ लुक एट सम एग्जांपल्स व्हिच विल क्लैरिफाई दीज पॉइंट्स. एन अनएक्सेप्टेबल pair of independent clauses would be in 1931 Oppenheimer attempted to find an equation for the photon that would be an analog to Dirac's equation for the electron, comma, he failed in this effort. अब जैसे कि आप देखें दोनों जो पार्ट्स हैं सेंटेंसेस के वो अपनी अपनी जगह इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉजेज हैं. In 1931 Oppenheimer attempted to find an equation to the photon that will be an analog to Dirac's equation for the electron. This in itself is an independent clause, and then the second independent clause is he failed in this effort. अब सिर्फ इनमें कॉमा के साथ इनको हमने सेपरेट किया हुआ है. This is incorrect. This is a comma splice. The acceptable version would be that instead of the comma we put either we put a full stop or a period and start the next independent clause with a capital letter. दोनों को अलग अलग sentences बना दें. वर्ड्स हमने कोई नहीं चेंज किए, ना हमने कोई अल्फाज इसमें ऐड किए हैं, सिर्फ कॉमा की जगह फुल स्टॉप लगाया है और फिर क्योंकि जाहिर है अगला जो लिखा फुल स्टॉप के बाद हमेशा कैपिटल लेटर आता है इसलिए ही का एच हमने कैपिटल कर दिया. अनदर वे ऑफ इंप्रूविंग दिस वुड बी सिंपली दैट you put after electron, after the first independent clause you put a semicolon. In 1931, Oppenheimer attempted to find an equation for the photon that would be an analog to Dirac's equation for the electron, semicolon. Then he failed in this effort, full stop. फिर आपने कैपिटल नहीं किया एच को क्योंकि सेमीकोलन के बाद जब आप शुरू करेंगे तो आप कैपिटल लेटर नहीं लगाएंगे, लेकिन आपने सेमीकोलन से इनको दो इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉजेस को लिंक कर दिया. या आप ये भी कह सकते हैं कि इलेक्ट्रॉन के बाद सेमीकोलन लगाएं और फिर आप however, comma, he failed in this effort. एक कंजंक्टिव एडवर्ब लगा दें, उसके बाद फिर कॉमा करके और आगे जो है सेंटेंस को कंप्लीट कर दीजिए. Another version would be include the comma and then with the comma add but. An analog to Dirac's equation for the electron, comma, but he failed in this effort. इसी को सबऑर्डिनेट क्लॉज भी आप इस तरह कर सकते हैं कि आप जो पहला हिस्सा है उसको सबऑर्डिनेट कर दें. ही फेल्ड इन दिस एफर्ट जो है वो आपका मेन इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉज रहे और जो पहला हिस्सा था वो आपका डिपेंडेंट क्लॉज हो जाए बाय यूजिंग द वर्ड ऑल्दो. यू कैन से ऑल्दो इन 1931 Oppenheimer attempted to find an equation for the photon that would be an analog to Dirac's equation for the electron, comma, he failed in this effort. Now another after comma splice, another common problem is fused sentences. This is similar to comma splice. Basically, this means that two independent clauses run together without a conjunction or punctuation between them. Comma splice में तो हमने देखा कि दो independent clauses थे, उनमें comma था, जबकि कुछ और होना चाहिए था. Fused sentences में ये होता है कि दो independent clauses होंगे और उनमें कोई punctuation नहीं होगी, comma भी नहीं होगा, और पता ही नहीं चलेगा कि एक आइडिया और दूसरा आइडिया, एक आइडिया कहाँ खत्म हो रहा है, दूसरा आइडिया कहाँ शुरू हो रहा है. So this is basically when two independent clauses run together without a conjunction or punctuation between them, and you should not allow this to happen in your writing at all. This error produces a fused sentence. And to correct fused sentences, you will use the same strategies as we talked about in when we were talking about comma splice. Let's have a look at some examples. It would be unacceptable to say a remote control for a car alarm works better held up at arm's length than at waist level, but works best when held under the chin. Physicists suggest that the body may be acting as an extension of the antenna. Now in this, there are two independent clauses. Pehla jo tha, talking about the remote control, held at arm's length, then at waist length, but works best when held under the chin. और दूसरा इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉज है जहां फिजिसिस्ट की बात हो रही है, दैट दे सजेस्ट दैट द बॉडी में एक्ट एज एन एक्सटेंशन ऑफ द एंटेना. बट दीज टू इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉजेस आर fused together as one sentence, and there is no punctuation in between to show any kind of link, to show any break. The acceptable version would be a remote control for a car alarm works better held up at arm's length than at waist level, but it works best when held under the chin. Semicolon. Physicists suggest that the body may be acting as an extension of the antenna. सिर्फ एक सेमीकोलन हमने इंक्लूड किया, लेकिन उससे सेंटेंसेस में दोनों जो इंडिपेंडेंट क्लॉजेस थे उनके आपस में ब्रेक आ गई है और वो अलग अलग नजर आ रहे हैं. Another unacceptable example would be lenticular clouds frequently form one above the other. Like a stack of pancakes at a distance, they may resemble a fleet of hovering spacecraft. Again, as you saw in this these fused sentences, there are two independent clauses and they are fused together, they are merged together without any punctuation. पढ़ने में भी बोलने में भी आपको ये नहीं समझ आती कि आपने पॉज कहाँ देना है, ब्रेक कहाँ देना है, कनेक्शन क्या है. एक नज़र इसको देखें और सोचें कि ब्रेक कहाँ आएगी. जैसे कि आप देख रहे हैं, दिस सेंटेंस कैन simply be made correct by adding a semicolon after pancakes to show the break between the two independent clauses. Another problem is stringy sentences. You need to avoid stringing several clauses that would be easier to read and understand if they were broken up into separate clauses. कोशिश करें कि बहुत सारे clauses को आप एक साथ string ना करें, क्योंकि उनको अलग अलग करके अगर देखेंगे तो वो ज़्यादा आसानी से समझ आएंगे. The following example make the point of how incoherent the language becomes with the use of stringy sentences. This example shows, or this example says, we must accept the facts and our enormous energy requirements, but it is also important not to forget that attempts to economize on safety provisions in such hazardous industries result in increased risk, and these increased risks may result in terrible tragedy, even in disasters whose consequences exceed national boundaries, although it is certainly true that a nuclear power station working safely without accident is ecologically one of the cleanest of all industrial plants. As you can see, there are a lot of different ideas, a lot of separate clauses which are complete and they have been strung together. The improved version would be, we must accept the facts and our enormous energy requirements, but it is also important not to forget that attempts to economize on safety provisions in such hazardous industries result in increased risk, full stop. And these increased risks may result in terrible tragedy, even in disasters whose consequences exceed national boundaries, full stop. It is certainly true, however, that a nuclear power station working safely without accident is ecologically one of the cleanest of all industrial plants. The same message, but said in 3 sentences rather than one long stringy sentence. Now, coming to something different, Up till now, we had been talking about how sentences were either stringy or fused or put together with a comma splice, and how that created problems. Let's have a look at agreement. Agreement between subjects and verbs and between pronouns and their antecedents is important for paragraph coherence as well as for style and grammar. When editing your document, check for agreement, paying close attention to subjects, verbs and pronouns. आपने ये देखना है कि आपके जो subjects, verbs हैं और pronouns हैं वो आपस में एक दूसरे के साथ agree कर रहे हैं या नहीं कर रहे हैं. कहीं ऐसे तो नहीं कि आपका noun कुछ और है और आपका pronoun जो है वो कुछ और indicate कर रहा है, या जो आपके pronoun का antecedent है, जिस चीज़ के बारे में वो pronoun mention कर रहा है, वो ही clear ना हो. Let's have a look at some examples and the concept will become clearer for you. But first, let's see what you need to do to make sure that your sentence has agreement. You need to make sure that your subject agrees with your verb. इसको हम subject verb agreement कहते हैं. You also need to make sure that your pronouns agree in gender and number with their antecedents. यानी जो भी आप pronouns इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं और जिस चीज़ के लिए आप वो pronouns इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं, आप वही gender इस्तेमाल करें. अगर आप किसी फीमेल चीज़ के लिए बात कर रहे हैं तो फिर प्रोनाउन भी फेमिनिन हो, मेल के लिए मैस्कुलिन हो, आपका नाउन मैस्कुलिन है तो उसका प्रोनाउन भी मैस्कुलिन हो. जो एंटीसीडेंट्स हैं वो जेंडर में अपने प्रोनाउन के साथ मैच करें. एंड ऑल्सो इन नंबर, इफ यू आर टॉकिंग ऑफ, इफ योर एंटीसीडेंट इज प्लूरल, देन योर प्रोनाउन हैज टू बी प्लूरल एज वेल. You also need to make sure that the form of your pronoun is appropriate for how you are using the pronoun in the sentence, the pronoun case. And for the sake of clarity, make sure that your pronouns are closely linked to their antecedent. We call this pronoun reference. जो pronouns के antecedent हैं उनके करीब में ही pronouns लिखे हुए हों ताकि ये अंदाज़ा रहे कि किस चीज़ के बारे में बात हो रही है. Your verb must agree with your subject in number and person. If your subject is singular, your verb must be singular. If your subject is plural, your verb must be plural. If your subject is in the first person, your verb must be in the first person. If your subject is in the second person or third person, your verb must agree. For example, for more than a century, researchers has known that exposure to high pressure can injure or kill living organisms. Now here, researchers and has do not agree. The acceptable form would be, for more than a century, researchers have known that exposure to high pressure can injure or kill. In general, you can think of subject-verb agreement as requiring one S per clause. हर clause के लिए एक S आपने अपने verb के साथ लगाना है. Either या अपने subject के साथ लगाना है. So either on the verb or on the subject, but never on both. दोनों के साथ S नहीं आएगा, या subject के साथ S आएगा या verb के साथ S आएगा. Of course, this rule applies only with present tense verbs and nouns, and those that do not have irregular plural forms. जो irregular plural forms हैं वो तो अलग हैं. Do not be led astray by modifying phrases that separate the subject and the verb. If you're not sure about the subject-verb agreement, test the sentence by leaving out the modifiers. बहुत से हमने पहले modifiers की बात की थी, देखे थे, तो आप अपने आप ये confuse मत हो कि आपने ऐसे ना हो कि आप इतने confuse हो जाएं कि आप modifier के साथ s लगा रहे हैं या आप अपने noun या verb के साथ s लगा रहे हैं. अगर आप sure नहीं हैं तो आप modifier हटा के sentence पढ़ के देखिए कि वो ठीक लगता है या नहीं लगता. An unacceptable example would be, a mixture of materials were used to withstand high temperatures. The subject here is mixture, not materials. So the verb should agree. It would be acceptable to say a mixture of materials was used to withstand high temperatures. Also, when you're using two or more nouns, if your subject contains two or more nouns, you need to pay special attention to subject-verb agreement. If the nouns are connected by the coordinating conjunction and, use a plural verb. Although accidents and congestion results from driving, etc., इसके बजाय आप कहेंगे although accidents and congestion result from driving. also, instead of saying your advisor or your course instructor are required to sign the form, you will say your advisor or your course instructor is required to sign the form. Unacceptable form would be both your advisor and your course instructor is required to sign the form. क्योंकि and है तो आप plural करेंगे. You will say both your advisor and your course instructor are required to sign the form. Similarly, if you're saying either your course instructor or 3 fellow students who know your ability is required to sign the form, तो ये गलत है. The better form would be either your course instructor or 3 fellow students who know your ability are required to sign the form. क्योंकि आप 3 fellow students की बात कर रहे हैं बाद में, तो जो आपका verb होगा वो plural होगा. इसी तरह अगर आप बाद में singular आपका subject है तो फिर आपका plural जो आपका verb है वो भी singular होगा. Instead of saying either 3 fellow students who know your ability or your course instructor are required to sign the form, आप कोर्स इंस्ट्रक्टर के साथ अपने वर्ब को अग्री करेंगे. यू विल से आइदर 3 फेलो स्टूडेंट्स हु नो योर एबिलिटी और योर कोर्स इंस्ट्रक्टर इज रिक्वायर्ड टू साइन द फॉर्म. जो भी बाद में आपका सब्जेक्ट होगा आपका वर्ब उसके साथ अग्री करेगा. इन दिस लेक्चर वी लुक्ड एट कॉमनली फाउंड लैंग्वेज प्रॉब्लम्स इन सेंटेंसेस. वी लुक्ड एट स्टैक्ड मॉडिफायर्स एंड नाउन्स, वर्डिनेस, ओवरलोडेड सेंटेंसेस, सेंटेंस फ्रैगमेंट्स, comma spliced fused sentences, stringy sentences, and we looked at agreement. And in the next lecture, we will continue reviewing language and we will continue looking at sentences. Until then, Allah Hafiz.